Let's now introduce our second speaker, Peter Shusterman. He's the Dorothy F. Schmidt Eminent Scholar in the Humanities, Professor of Philosophy and English, and Director of the Center of Body, Mind, and Culture at Florida Atlantic University. He has held academic appointments almost everywhere: Paris, Berlin, Hiroshima, Rome, Oslo, Vienna, Hong Kong, Shanghai. And his research interests cover a variety of topics, including aesthetics, culture, language, identity, and embodiment. His publications include several books. I will just mention some of them. Practicing Philosophy, Pragmatism, and the Philosophical Life, 1997. Thinking Through the Body, 2012, and more recently, so 2 years ago, 2022, Philosophy and the Art of Writing. The title of the paper, as well of the chapter, reads Philosophy as a Way of Life and Pragmatism. Thank you very much, and you're very welcome to start reading your paper, please.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. I'm going to read the paper. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, and I won't be able to stay for much of the conference. So let me get started reading. The title is Pragmatism, Practicing Philosophy as an Art of Living. Key ideas of philosophy as a way of life, PWL, are significantly present and influential in the tradition of American pragmatism, although its discussion of these topics is rarely pursued under the explicit term philosophy as a way of life. There are clear reasons for both these phenomena. As pragmatism is a philosophy deeply concerned with action and practice, its concern for philosophy's manifestation in action and the practice of life should be obvious. It also imbibed, often self-consciously, the practical, hardy spirit of American life and New World culture that had less respect for old European scholasticisms in philosophy and in other cultural fields. On the other hand, the pragmatist philosophers, unlike their transcendentalist and Enlightenment predecessors, were academics who strove for recognition in the academic world of professional philosophy. This makes openly championing PWL problematic, because since ancient times, the advocates of PWL often sharply opposed it to academic philosophy, whose practitioners it dismissed as not being real philosophers. We find this in Transcendentalist Thoreau's famous complaint, "There are nowadays professors of philosophy, but not philosophers, yet it is admirable to profess because it was once admirable to live." Given this traditional opposition, to insist on PWL rather than academic philosophy risks alienating colleagues, and thus diminishes pragmatism's hope to establish itself as an important philosophical current. So pragmatist philosophers pursued the central themes of PWL more discreetly by formulating them through somewhat different terms. We can appreciate this strategy by considering the philosophical fate of Thoreau and his mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, toweringly important thinkers who have been largely neglected by academic philosophy and relegated to the realm of literature. Their insistence on the practical, somatic dimension of philosophy was an inspiration for some later pragmatist philosophers, myself included. So was the aesthetic dimension they advocated for the conduct of life. Art, says Emerson, must not be a superficial talent of making cripples and monsters, such as all pictures and statues are, but must serve the ideal by remaking men and women of character. There is higher work for art than the arts, he continues, Nothing less than the creation of man and nature is its end, end of quote. Thoreau provides a still more explicit formulation of this aesthetic. It is something to be able to paint a particular picture or to carve a statue, and so to make a few objects beautiful. But it is far more glorious to carve and paint the very atmosphere and medium through which we look, which morally we can do. To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts. Every man is tasked to make his life, even in its details, worthy of the contemplation of his most elevated and critical hour. This concern with elevation expressed the meliorism central to PWL rather than an elitist aestheticist distinction. Combining respect for democracy and individualism, Emerson and Thoreau urged that everyone could, in principle, lead their own philosophical life of melioristic endeavor. In what follows, I confine myself to the classical pragmatists, Peirce, James, and Dewey, plus neo-pragmatist Richard Rorty. But first, I note a forerunner of American pragmatist PWL, who, unlike Emerson and Thoreau, is rarely discussed by pragmatist philosophers, namely Benjamin Franklin. Although an accomplished scientist, writer, and founder of what became the University of Pennsylvania, Franklin was no academic. He ended his formal schooling at age 10. However, he clearly advocated philosophy as a way of life, introducing what he called his bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection by invoking Cicero's praise of the philosophical life. I quote in English, "O philosophy, thou guide of life, explorer of virtues and expeller of vice, one day well spent and in accordance with thy lessons is to be preferred to an eternity of error," end of quote. To achieve his goal, and I quote again, the goal was to live without committing any fault at any time. Franklin deployed the ascesis of daily self-examination of flaws in maintaining 13 key virtues, which he pursued through an ingenious graphic method of charting his daily and weekly progress in diary form. Now I turn to the classical pragmatists. C.S. Peirce, the acknowledged originator of pragmatism, initially seems more an opponent than a proponent of PWL, condemning, and I quote, "with the whole strength of conviction, the Hellenic tendency to mingle philosophy and practice," end of quote. And he affirmed his key philosophical project was philosophical science as a purely theoretical science of discovery, which he said, and I quote again, "has nothing directly to say concerning practical matters," end of quote. But Peirce affirms the existence of practical philosophical sciences that do serve the conduct of life. So alongside the pure theoretical normative philosophical sciences of logic, ethics, and aesthetics, he recognizes, I quote, "three corresponding arts or practical sciences that should govern the conduct of life." The aesthetic for Peirce is their subsuming end. I quote, "As logic is the theory of self-controlled or deliberate thought, and as such must appeal to ethics for its principles, so ethics must appeal to aesthetics for aid in determining the summum bonum, or ideal to which ethics should aspire," end of quote. For Peirce, there is deep continuity between the aesthetic and aesthetical, and they converge in the ancient Greek ideal of kalos kai agathos, the beautiful and good, as the summum bonum to which the disciplined self-control and self-cultivation of ethical conduct should be directed. Indeed, late in life, recognizing how his inadequately controlled behavior ruined his own professional life, Peirce affirms the ascesis of self-control guided by ethics and aesthetics as necessary for proper training in directing the conduct of life. He insists that ethics should aim at self-control for self-mastery with, I quote, "the aim to make one's life beautiful and admirable, and the science of admirable is true aesthetics, end of quote. Along with the aesthetic, meliorous dimensions of admirable living, the themes of self-examination and somatic training are similarly salient in Peirce. I quote, "If conduct is to be thoroughly deliberate, the ideal must be a habit of feeling which has grown up under the influence of a course of self-criticisms and of heterocriticisms, and the theory of the deliberate formulation of such habits of feeling is what ought to be meant by aesthetics," end of quote. Affirming the value of such training, Peirce claims, I quote again, "I have gone through a systematic course of training in recognizing my feelings. I have worked with intensity for so many hours a day, every day for long years, to train myself to do this. And it is a training which I would recommend to all of you," end of quote. This confession comes in the context of noting the variety of pain in which he had an agonizingly rigorous training. Beginning in his senior year at Harvard and continuing throughout his life, Peirce suffered from an excruciatingly painful neurological disease called trigeminal neuralgia, then medically termed fascial neuralgia, which worsens with age and whose pain is debilitating to normal functioning, let alone intense mental labor. Peirce's training in discriminating sensory feelings also included the more pleasurable study of the olfactory and gustatory discrimination of fine wines. In Paris, I quote, "He hired the tutelage of a sommelier and became a connoisseur of wines." In his 20s, Peirce rigorously trained in weightlifting and later wrote how it both increased his muscular strength while boosting his spirits. I turn now to William James, who also did not thematize PW as such, believing that in the actual practice of ethical life, the philosopher was not essentially different from other people. Both philosophers and common people have to make practical ethical decisions in the conduct of their lives. They cannot remain in indifferent theoretical objectivity, but must choose as partisans of their cherished values and ideals. I quote, "In all this, the philosopher is just like the rest of us non-philosophers, striving that the goods to which he is sensible may not be submerged and lost from out of life," end of quote. As philosophy's abstract theoretical absolutes cannot effectively address the concrete complexities of life's choices that always involve a unique situation, so, I quote, "The philosopher then, qua philosopher, is no better able to determine the best choice in the concrete situation than other men," end of quote. In making concrete choices of conduct, it is simply our character and total personal genius that are on trial. I quote again, "From this unsparing practical ordeal, no professor's lectures and no array of books can save us," end of quote. Along with this democratic stance that refuses to grant philosophical learning special ethical privilege, James insists on the variety of legitimate values, and he urges a tolerant pluralism regarding the very different ways that philosophers and other people combine those values into a vision of the ideal. Because these values and ideals often sharply conflict, James thinks, I quote, "some part of the ideal must be butchered." So James affirms a pluralist ethical ideal that satisfies the most values and butchers the least. His emphasis on affirming the richer vision, one that combines diversity in the form of unity and equilibrium of human values, reflects the important aesthetic dimension in James' ethical PWL. Explaining rationality as governed by two general principles, the aesthetic principle of ease and the aesthetic demand for clearness, James likewise attributes differences of philosophical visions ultimately to aesthetic discords. James is keenly aware that one's vision of the best life can always be challenged by ongoing experience that creates new values and puts old ones in question. I quote, "As there is nothing final in any actually given equilibrium of human ideals, so concrete ethics cannot be final," end of quote. This is the crucial fallibilistic aspect of James's approach to the conduct of life. But fallibilism is not skeptical nihilism, so one has every right to affirm and act on one's ideals. James is forthright in advocating his, including his democratic tolerance and pluralistic respect for individual feelings and preferences, captures in his ethical aesthetical ideal of maximum inclusiveness with the least butchering of ideals, but also in his appreciation of different philosophies owing to the different characters and life experiences of different philosophers. There can be no single form of philosophy and no single formula for the philosophical life because philosophers are different. I quote from James again, "A philosophy is the expression of a man's intimate character, and all definitions of the universe are but the deliberately adopted reactions of human characters upon it, are just so many visions, modes of feeling the whole push of life, forced on one by one's total character and experience," end of quote. Another key PWL value for James is the struggle of meliorist ascesis that James expresses through his notion of what he calls the strenuous mood of struggle and his admiration of hardihood and heroism. Dissatisfied with the cultured, comfort-rich resort of Chautauqua because it lacked the element of strength and strenuousness, intensity and danger, James affirmed the ethics of self-challenging struggle where one is, I quote, "willing to pay with his own person if need be for the realization of the ideals which he frames," end of quote. James thus searched for what he calls a moral equivalent of war that was free of war's evils, but maintained what he thought was war's moral attraction as, I quote, "the supreme theater of human strenuousness." He claimed, I quote again, "Militarism is the great preserver of our ideals of hardihood, and human life with no use for hardihood would be contemptible," end of quote. More generally, he advocates meliorist ascesis in his practical maxim, I quote, "Keep the faculty of effort alive in you by a little gratuitous exercise every day. That is, be systematically heroic in little unnecessary points for no other reason than its difficulty," end of quote. James insists on a certain ultimate hardihood in engaging tomorrow's flight for a better world, since, I quote, "the world is still in the process of making, and we have a role in the world's salvation, which depends on the energizing of its parts, among which we are," end of quote. We find a distinct somatic dimension to these ideals of effort, hardihood, and heroism, including, I quote, "the heroism of common toil that James praised in the physically laboring classes." James explicitly affirms, I quote, "the ideal of the well-trained and vigorous body, believing that its benefits are spiritual as well as physical, as internal peace and confidence wells up from every part of the body of a muscularly well-trained human being," end of quote. And it is not surprising that James links the strenuous mood to passionate somatic feelings. There is, however, an important point where James diverges from traditional PWL. He was very wary of intense self-examination that belongs to the practice of spiritual exercises of self-examination, because he personally found, I quote, those introspective studies had bred a sort of philosophical hypochondria in me, end of quote. As a young adult, James suffered from very serious and long bouts of depression, spurred by intense self-examination and the sentiments of self-doubt that they prompted. The examination of one's feelings he considered particularly pernicious, claiming, I quote, "There is no better known or more generally useful precept in the moral training of youth or in one's personal self-discipline than that which bids us pay primary attention to what we do and express and not to care too much for what we feel," end of quote. John Dewey was the pragmatist most explicitly critical of professional philosophy, condemning its focus on theoretical issues about ultimate reality, focusing on the problems of ordinary life, rather than focusing on the problems of ordinary life. Dewey could afford to be fiercely critical, as he had already won fame and influence as a professional philosopher, while pragmatism had, by his time, already established itself in academic philosophy. Dewey rebuked his profession for shirking the duty of bringing philosophy to bear on what he calls the living struggles and issues of its own age and times, end of quote, and instead keeping to its old academic problems so as to maintain, I quote again, an immune monastic impeccability without relevancy and bearing in the contemporary present, end of quote. Condemning its retreat into smug, scholastic professionalism, Dewey insisted that philosophy will recover its true worth as a life-centered enterprise only, I quote, when it ceases to be a device for dealing with the problems of philosophers and becomes a method cultivated by philosophers for dealing with the problems of men, end of quote. He recognized, I quote again, that philosophy has greatly declined in esteem and influence since its ancient practice as the supreme guide to the diverse arts of living, when it was what he called the art of arts, end of quote. Dewey's pragmatism highlights philosophy's ultimately practical life-enhancing function. It is not simply an art of life, but, I quote, the comprehensive art of the wise conduct of life itself, end of quote. It is a criticism, I quote again, of life in the interest of more intense and just appreciation of the meanings present in experience. Its primary concern is to clarify, liberate, and extend the goods which inhere in the naturally generated functions of experience. Rather than a form of science, philosophy is a form of desire, of effort and action, a love, namely of wisdom, where wisdom is not factual knowledge, but a conviction about moral values, a sense for the better kind of life to be lived, end of quote. As a passionate but critical interpretation of life, philosophy involves, I quote again, a moral resolution to prize one mode of life more highly than another, end of quote. Such a vision democratically opens the practice of philosophy to anyone with such convictions, rather than reserving it for a distinctive group of philosophy professionals. Like James, Dewey insists on pluralism and personal vision in PWL. Rival philosophies, I quote, are different ways of construing life, whose differences can be both valid and valuable, since they are often based on different temperaments and very different conditions of living that inspire different passionate desires and hopes, end of quote. Hence, philosophy must involve change, since the conditions of the world are always changing. And PWL must allow differences in people's ways of practicing it, as individuals are in different situations and their lives and life options are shaped by those differing circumstances. Besides being practical and pluralistic, Dewey's approach to PWL involves distinctive aesthetic, sematical, and political dimensions. His revisionary theory of art as experience is aimed at overcoming art's compartmentalization and recovering what he calls the continuity of aesthetic experience with the normal process of living so that art can be better integrated into life. This is not only because aesthetic experience provides necessary ingredients of happiness, but because he construes art widely as the organizing refinement of any medium, including the medium of life itself. Valorizing the body as life's medium, Dewey recognized the body's powers of consciousness and cognition, while highlighting its ability to be trained to become more perceptive and effective. A devoted student and advocate of Alexander technique, he spent over 20 years of his later life in somatic training through this technique, writing enthusiastic introductions to 3 of Alexander's major books. Making this body-developing discipline part of his philosophical pursuit of self-enrichment and growth, Dewey lived a gratifyingly healthy life into his 90s and attributed his longevity to such somatic philosophical living. Dewey's notion of aesthetic living, like his concept of art, is not an elitist aestheticism. He was critical of high art's sacralizing compartmentalization and its demand to be radically new, which he regarded as the result of art's professionalization under capitalism. Deprived of its
I'm sorry, your microphone suddenly turned off. We don't hear you anymore.
good place. Okay, let's see if this works.
Yeah, we are hearing you now. Thanks.
Okay. So deprived of its traditional social roles, art is reduced to the production of gratuitous commodities, specimens of fine art, and nothing else, put up for sale in the impersonality of the word market and forced to seduce buyers through novelty and uniqueness. Artists are thus impelled to develop a peculiarly acute individualism that makes their works increasingly difficult for the general public to fathom and enjoy, an intolerable situation for the democratic Dewey. Rather than individualistic innovation, his art theory highlights unity, communicability, and dynamic developing richness. The same balance shapes the ideal of aesthetic living. Though his liberalism advocates self-realization, Dewey insists that the individual best realizes herself not by consciously cultivating her personal peculiar distinction, but by immersing herself in associated life. He thought that concentrating narrowly on the project of self-creation will rob one of the wide sympathies and materials needed to transform the self in richer ways. Similarly, Dewey's concept of self-transformation was aimed not at radical novelty for its own sake, but rather at continuous, coherent, meliorative growth. As embodied life, PWL essentially involves time and change. To be aesthetic, it demands not merely change, but attractive, coherent development or growth. Self-transformation is thus central to the philosophical life. As every individual organism must adapt to survive, change is built into our most basic natural needs and physiological rhythms. For Dewey, who advocated self-realization as the moral ideal, the aim of coherent, enriching change was captured by the ideal of creative growth. Rejecting not simply the idea of a fixed, ready-made, finished self, but even the notion of any fixed or final ends for self-realization, Dewey concluded, and I quote, "The end is growth itself," end of quote, as this would include the development of new ends that were previously unimagined. Dewey therefore argues, I quote, "We should fight against induration and fixity in the self so as to realize the possibility of its recreation. The growing, enlarging, liberated self goes forth to meet new demands and occasions and readjusts and remakes itself in the process. It welcomes untried situations, for those are precisely what best provides it with new possibilities of growth." End of quote. As Dewey's perfectionist PWL advocates transformative, enriching growth, so moral goodness is not an absolute state or quality. Moral goodness is rather a comparative measure of striving to be better. One who has a high level of moral self-development but seeks to go no farther is thus less moral than a less developed self who is faithfully working towards self-improvement. I quote, "Direction of movement, not the plane of attainment and rest, determines moral quality." End of quote. The problem, however, is what will sustain the unity of the self through continued change, because unity of some sort seems important for the notion of self-realization. Hellenistic philosophers could advocate unity and integrity by appealing to one's true self or ruling principle, and by prizing the tranquility of uniformity over the hazards of change. But this strategy of unity seems challenged by Dewey's ethic of continued transformation without the security of the fixed self that Dewey rejected and that is more problematic to have in modern times. To reconcile the demand for change with the aesthetic need for integrity and harmony, Dewey recommended that the self's changes be coherently organized, I quote, around sincere, enduring interests, so the unity of one's personal identity is found in the thread of continuous development, which binds together these changes, end of quote.
Sorry, if I interrupt you, but you should try to conclude because time is almost over. Thank
Okay,
you.
well, I'm ready to conclude now.
Great, thank you. So thank you very much for this paper, for being that understanding in concluding immediately. So we have time for 2 or 3 questions depending on the length of the question and the answers. So first of all, we have one question here. Maybe chat with somebody online is going to ask something, but I don't see anything.
Okay.
Thank you for such a wonderful talk. I am a little bit curious as to why there's no space for Jane Addams in your chapter, especially considering her close relationship with Dewey and the way that she actually lived out the theories of pragmatism with her work at Hull House. And I know a lot of your focus is on aesthetics, and there is work on Jane Addams and aesthetics. And Addams herself said, quote, "Art has always been embodied as the ultimate aim of Hull House." And as I said, she and Dewey were both incredibly mutually influential, where I think Dewey himself said that Addams' life and the work that she's doing actually shows pragmatism in action.
Well, there were space constraints, and just like there are time constraints. So, I had to leave out figures. There are other figures I would have liked to have included, like Alan Locke, but yeah, that's just a choice.
Any other questions, considerations? Online, is there anybody willing to say something? Okay.
Sorry, I'll try to enter the camera angle. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting, and all these elements of pluralism were different from many other periods where we were considering philosophy as a way of life. I was particularly impressed with this idea that the moral goodness is striving to be better. So in a certain way, could we say that differently from what often is said in the philosophy as a way of life literature, or this model that it's a matter of trying to live according to one's doctrines or one's worldview. Here is a constant attempt to try to change it instead of trying to implement it. Do you see this as a faithful representation of what is here at issue, or is this a false contrast or an uninteresting one?
No, I wrote about that in Practicing Philosophy. The modern world is just different. There's a different concept of what it is to be an individual. There's a different idea of self-realization without a kind of clear telos. And particularly in a society like American society at the end of the 19th and 20th century. But you have it in Europe as well. You can look at Georg Simmel in the Großstadt and the geistige Leben. The idea that with all the people and all the greater resources for self-expression and self-realization, people feel a need to assert their individuality in a way that in ancient times, not so many people had that privilege, and it wasn't a kind of ideal. I mean, one turning point, you could say, might be Rousseau for the idea of expression and authenticity. Authenticity is a very important aspect of, as I see it, of philosophy as a way of life in modern times. And, you know, you have it in Emerson and Thoreau, where the idea is, don't follow me, be your own person. And that's just very different. So, and the idea of progress, moral progress, that's something you can find also in Wittgenstein, but in a certain way you can find it in some of the Asian traditions, in Confucianism. You know, there's this melioristic doctrine of judging people. Not everyone can start at the highest level because of circumstances, but moral worth is about the desire to raise oneself higher. I mean, Emerson has this nice idea in circles about the drive to lift yourself to a higher threshold that you are is very basic. So those two elements, but particularly the element of individual expression, it's just very different. So I think it's harder in a way to do the philosophical life in modern times for that reason, because you really have to strike out on your own. And there are tremendous social pressures to conform. And I think, as I said in the beginning, that's why PWL is not thematized in pragmatist philosophy. Peirce was never able to get a proper university job. James became a professor of philosophy through the back door. He originally was able to teach in the medical school and the physiology department, and kind of snuck into the philosophy department. Dewey was the most critical because by the time he started criticizing, he was already an important professional philosopher.
Thank you very much.